My brother locked my 6-year-old diabetic son outside in 98-degree Georgia heat because Owen walked in on something he was never supposed to see. That is the truth. Not the version my brother told my father, not the version his wife posted on social media 3 days later, the actual truth which I now have on camera, in financial records, and in federal court documents. I still remember exactly what the nurse said when she called me in Chicago. She said, "Ma'am, your son was brought in by a neighbor. He's stable, but his blood sugar was critically low and he's severely dehydrated." I remember sitting down on the floor of my hotel room still in my blazer from the client meeting I had just left. I remember the carpet was blue-gray. I remember calling my brother 4 times and getting voicemail every single time. I am 29 years old. I am a forensic accountant at a federal financial crimes consulting firm, which is a way of saying I spend my working life following money trails that other people think are invisible. My father, Leonard, built a mid-sized construction company in Atlanta called Dawson Construction over 30 years. It is his identity and his legacy, and the thing he talks about at every family dinner like it is a living, breathing member of the family. My older brother Terrence has been VP of Operations at Dawson for 4 years, ever since he married Kristin. My father was so happy to finally have a son, taking an interest in the business, that he handed Terrence a corner office and a company credit card before the ink was dry on the marriage certificate. I was always the difficult daughter, the one who asked too many questions, the one who went and got a finance degree and then a graduate certificate in forensic auditing instead of coming home to work at Dawson like my father wanted. After my divorce 3 years ago, I moved back to Georgia and tried to rebuild a relationship with my father, mostly for Owen's sake. I wanted my son to have a grandfather. Owen is 6. He has had type 1 diabetes since he was 3. He wears a continuous glucose monitor on his arm and carries a small kit with his insulin pen and juice boxes wherever he goes. He knows what low blood sugar feels like. He knows to tell an adult immediately. He is the most responsible 6-year-old I have ever met, probably because he has had to be. I had a mandatory 3-day on-site audit in Chicago for a federal client. I could not bring Owen. I asked my father if Owen could stay at the family house in Buckhead for the long weekend. My father said yes without hesitation. He seemed genuinely pleased. I left detailed instructions. I packed Owen's kit in a bright red bag and labeled every single item. I wrote out his meal schedule, his insulin timing, the number for his endocrinologist. I sat on the edge of my father's kitchen counter and went over everything twice while Owen stood next to me eating a granola bar, nodding along seriously like a small person at a business meeting. I was on a conference call at 4:47 on a Saturday afternoon when my phone lit up with a 404 number I did not recognize. I silenced it. It called again. I stepped out of the room. The hospital social worker told me that an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Patterson, who lives directly behind my father's property, had looked through her fence at around 2 in the afternoon and seen a small boy lying on the patio. She thought he was asleep. An hour later, he had not moved. She called 911. The paramedics broke through the side gate. Owen was found on the concrete patio in direct sun. The outdoor temperature that afternoon was 98 degrees Fahrenheit. His glucose monitor had been alarming for over an hour. His insulin kit was inside the house. The deadbolt on the back door had been engaged from the inside. I was at Hartsfield-Jackson by 7 that evening. My brother arrived at the pediatric unit 40 minutes after I did. I had been sitting in the chair beside Owen's bed for half an hour, watching the IV line and the glucose monitor and listening to the particular sound of my child breathing, small and steady and exhausted. When I heard Terrence's voice at the nurse's station down the hall, asking which room, I stood up and walked out into the corridor. He came around the corner and stopped walking the second he saw me. My brother is 41 years old and 6 feet 1. He fills a room. He has always known it and used it. But standing in that hospital hallway, he looked like a man who had just stepped on ice he did not know was there. His jaw tightened. His eyes went to the room behind me and then back to my face. He recovered fast. He always recovers fast. He told me he was so glad I made it, like I had come to a birthday party. He tried to pull me into a hug I did not return. Then he leaned back and started talking about how worried they had all been, how the afternoon had been such a misunderstanding, how Owen had gotten into Kristin's home office and knocked her laptop off the desk and cracked the screen, and Terrence had told him to sit outside for a few minutes while they figured out what happened. He said the heat was never meant to go on that long. He said he thought Dad was keeping an eye on things. He did not ask me how Owen was doing, not once. I looked at my brother and did not say a single word. I turned around and walked back into Owen's room and sat down beside him. Terrence stood in the doorway for a moment and then left. Kristin arrived 20 minutes later. She is one of those women who manages to look composed in every situation, like she has rehearsed for every room she walks into. She came in carrying an iced coffee. She sat across from me and crossed her legs and said she was so sorry this had gotten so out of hand. Then she very calmly explained that Owen had not just bumped into the laptop. He had gone into the office deliberately, started clicking through files on the screen, and when their son Briggs tried to stop him, Owen shoved Briggs and called him a name. I knew Owen. Owen says shoot when he drops something and apologizes to the furniture when he bumps into it. He had never raised a hand to anyone in his life. Kristin reached into her purse and set a check on the edge of the hospital tray table. It was written on an account I did not recognize, not Terrence's personal checking, not a Dawson account. $40,000. She told me it would cover the medical bills and then some, and that she hoped we could handle this privately as a family, without involving anyone who did not need to be involved. She said the last part looking directly at me. I picked up the check by the corner and looked at it for a long moment. The account name was Kenwood Property Group LLC. The routing number at the bottom meant nothing to me yet. I folded the check and put it in my jacket pocket. I told Kristin thank you and that I would be in touch. She looked surprised that I had not argued. She left before Owen woke up. Owen woke up at 9:15 that night. He was groggy and thirsty, and his voice was rough in a way that made my chest ache. He reached for my hand before he was fully awake. When he was alert enough, he looked at me very seriously and said, "Mommy, I'm sorry I made Uncle Terrence mad." I told him he did not do a single thing wrong. I kept my voice level. I asked him if he wanted to tell me what happened. He said he woke up from his nap and he was hungry and his monitor was beeping. He went downstairs to find his kit. He got confused about which room was which and opened the wrong door. He said Uncle Terrence and Aunt Kristin were at the desk, and there were a lot of papers spread out, and they both looked like how Owen looks when he gets caught sneaking a cookie before dinner. He said Briggs came in from the hallway and grabbed his arm and told him to get out. He said it hurt. He said he tried to explain about his monitor beeping, and Briggs pushed him through the back door and it locked. He said he knocked on the glass for a long time. He said no one came. He said he got very tired and sat down and then he did not remember anything else. I held his hand until he fell back asleep. Then I walked to the family lounge at the end of the hall, sat down in the farthest chair from the door, and called my colleague Isaiah. Isaiah is a former IRS criminal investigations agent who now does financial forensics at our firm. He has spent 15 years following money into places it was never supposed to go. He answered on the second ring. I told him I needed a full trace on a routing number and an LLC called Kenwood Property Group. I told him I needed it clean and fast. He asked if this was personal. I told him it was very personal, but that I thought it might also be professional. I heard him start typing before I finished the sentence. My father came to the hospital the following morning. He had not come the night before. He stood at the foot of Owen's bed in his weekend clothes and looked at his grandson, and I watched something cross his face that might have been guilt, but it passed too quickly to be sure. Then he sat down across from me and told me the family needed to move forward together. He said that Terrence was deeply sorry. He said Kristin had mentioned I seemed hostile, which concerned him. He said he hoped I was not planning to make things unnecessarily complicated. I asked him if he knew Owen had been outside for over 2 hours. He said children are more resilient than we give them credit for. I asked him if he knew Owen's monitor had been alarming the entire time. He said he had not been home when it happened. I stopped asking questions. My father left and called his attorney that afternoon. By the time visiting hours ended, I had been formally notified via email that Leonard Dawson had executed an emergency amendment to his family trust, removing me as a beneficiary and transferring my share of any future estate to Terrence. His attorney included a note clarifying that this was deliberate and not an oversight. I read the email twice. Then I went back into Owen's room and read him 3 chapters of his favorite book about a mouse who builds a clock, and I did not think about my father at all. Isaiah called me the next morning. He had run the routing number. Kenwood Property Group LLC was registered in Delaware 18 months ago through a registered agent in Wilmington with no physical office address. The account Kristin's check had been drawn on had received a series of large wire transfers over the past 14 months from a construction subcontractor called Meridian Site Services. Isaiah paused, then he said, Adrienne, Meridian Site Services is listed as a subcontractor on 3 Dawson Construction federal projects. All 3 are HUD-funded affordable housing developments in Fulton and DeKalb counties. I sat down. He told me the billing records were public. Meridian had been invoiced by Dawson and paid by HUD for concrete foundation work, electrical rough-in, and HVAC installation across all 3 sites. The amounts were very substantial. But Isaiah had spent the morning cross-referencing the invoice dates with permit records, inspection logs, and satellite imagery of the construction sites. He said the work wasn't done, or it wasn't done anywhere close to those prices. I'm looking at a site that billed HUD for a complete foundation pour in October. The permit for that foundation wasn't filed until December. The total discrepancy across all 3 projects came to approximately $2.9 million. Meridian Site Services was not a real subcontractor. It was Kenwood Property Group with a different name. And Kenwood Property Group was the account Kristin had drawn that check from in the hospital room while my son was on an IV drip, handing me a direct line into a federal fraud case and calling it generosity. She had been so certain I would cash it quietly and disappear. She handed a forensic accountant the routing number to a federal housing fraud scheme and thought she was buying my silence. Isaiah asked what I wanted to do. I told him to hold everything and give me 24 hours. I called the records office at Dawson Constructions using the company's public number and asked for the current certificate of insurance on Meridian Site Services. The woman who answered said she would need to check with the VP of Operations. I told her not to bother. I had everything I needed. Owen was discharged the following afternoon. He fell asleep in the car before we left the parking deck. I watched him in the rearview mirror for a long moment before I started the engine. His glucose monitor glowed steady green on his arm. His stuffed elephant was tucked under his chin. He looked so small. I drove us home and put him to bed. Then I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, building a complete financial timeline. Every invoice, every payment, every wire transfer, every date. By the time I finished, the picture was clean and total. There were no gaps Terrence could slide through. I texted my contact at the HUD Office of Inspector General. Her name is Agent Reeves, and we had worked together twice before on unrelated cases. I told her I had something significant and asked if she could meet the following week. She said yes within 4 minutes. My father's annual shareholder dinner for Dawson Construction was scheduled for that Friday evening. He held it every year at a private event room at a steakhouse in Buckhead. Investors, contractors, city council members, a few of the county commissioners who had approved Dawson's federal contracts. My father wore the same charcoal blazer every year. He called it his lucky jacket. I knew this because I had attended every year until 4 years ago, when Terrence joined the company and the invitations quietly stopped coming. I did not need an invitation this time. I wore a dark suit and low heels. I drove myself. I arrived 15 minutes after the dinner started, when everyone was on their second drink and the room was warm and loud. I walked through the front of the restaurant and through the private room door before anyone could intercept me. My father was standing near the head of the table telling a story about a project in Marietta. He saw me and his expression moved through surprise and then irritation and then the particular stillness of a man who is calculating very fast. Terrence was seated 3 chairs down. He saw me a second later. He went still in a different way, the way a person goes still when they realize something they planned for has arrived ahead of schedule. Kristin set down her wine glass. I did not raise my voice. I walked to the empty place at the center of the long table and set down a manila folder. I told the room I apologized for interrupting dinner. I said I had something that affected several people in that room, and they deserved to know before it became public record. I looked at the 2 county commissioners at the far end. I looked at the bank representative beside my father. I looked at the project manager from the HUD regional office, who came to these dinners every year and who I recognized the moment I walked in. I opened the folder. I had printed selected pages, the Meridian invoices alongside the corresponding permit dates, satellite images showing the incomplete construction sites, wire transfer records into the Kenwood account, and the check Kristin had placed on a hospital tray table, $40,000 drawn on a fraud account, with a memo line that read Medical Family Matter. I set them out one by one on the white tablecloth while the room got very quiet. My father said my name once, then he stopped. Terrence stood up hard enough that his chair scraped back. He pointed at me and said this was harassment. He said I was a bitter, unstable woman who had never forgiven the family for standing together while I went through my divorce, and that anything I was showing them was fabricated or taken entirely out of context. I let him talk. Kristin stood beside him and said I had manufactured a crisis around my own son to gain sympathy and create a pretext to attack the family business. She said it clearly and loudly, with the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed this exact speech. I let her talk too. Then I turned to the HUD project manager at the far end of the table and said his office had funded 3 affordable housing projects through Dawson Construction in the past 14 months. I said the work on all 3 had been overbilled against a subcontractor that did not exist, and I had the full documentation to support that, which I had already provided to the HUD Office of Inspector General. He had already gone pale before I finished the sentence. The door to the private room opened. Agent Reeves walked in with 2 colleagues. She introduced herself and presented credentials to the room. She said the OIG had reviewed preliminary documentation and was executing investigative authority related to potential federal housing fraud on HUD-funded contracts. She asked Terrence and Kristin to step aside with her colleagues. Terrence looked at my father. My father looked at the folder on the table. There was a long silence that had the specific quality of something that cannot be unsaid. Terrence made one last attempt. He told Agent Reeves this was a family dispute being dressed up as a federal matter, that his sister had a documented history of emotional difficulty following her divorce, and that she had clear personal motive too. Agent Reeves said, "Sir, I'm not here because of your sister, I'm here because of the records." They walked Terrence and Kristin out of the room. The dinner dissolved after that. The commissioners left without making eye contact with anyone. The bank representative collected his cards and said goodnight to no one in particular. The project manager stayed for a moment looking at the documents on the table, and then he left too. The room emptied in under 10 minutes, the way rooms do when the thing holding everyone together suddenly isn't there anymore. My father and I were the only ones left. He looked at the documents still spread across the tablecloth, and then he looked at me. He said he had not known about the fraud. I told him I believed him. I had not found any evidence that he was involved. The forensic trail went to Terrence's email account and the LLC, which Terrence controlled entirely. He asked me what happened next. I told him the company's federal contracts would be suspended pending investigation. Because the fraud had run through Dawson's accounts and billing systems, the company would be subject to a full federal audit. I also told him that during the previous 72 hours, I had identified the primary commercial lenders holding significant debt on Dawson's current project pipeline. My firm had quietly acquired 2 of those debt positions through a network of entities. My father stared at me. I told him that as the primary creditor on those notes, my firm had the legal right to call the loans immediately upon confirmed evidence of fraud. I told him I was not going to do that tonight. I told him what happened next depended on his full cooperation with the federal investigation and several other things we would discuss in the morning, with attorneys present on both sides. He asked me why. He meant why any of it, why I had been the one to find this, why I was the one sitting across from him in that empty room, why I had not simply cashed the check and walked away. I said, because Owen deserved a grandfather who makes better choices, and I'm giving you the chance to be that. I picked up the folder. I left one page on the table. It was the trust amendment his attorney had emailed me, the one removing me as a beneficiary, his signature in blue ink at the bottom. I had written one line across the top of it in marker before I left the house that evening. It said he was 6 years old and he needed his insulin kit. I left the restaurant and drove home. Owen was with my babysitter. He was asleep. I sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time and listened to him breathe. In the months that followed, the federal investigation moved with the particular efficiency of agencies that have something clean to work with. Kristin entered a plea agreement and cooperated against my brother in exchange for a reduced charge. Terrence was convicted on 6 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of fraudulent use of federal contracting funds. He was sentenced to 7 years in a federal facility in South Carolina. He wore a suit to sentencing. It was the last suit he wore for a very long time. Briggs went to live with Kristin's parents in Tennessee. I thought about him sometimes, a 9-year-old boy dropped into the wreckage his parents made. I thought about what it means to teach a child that cruelty is acceptable when it protects the people you love. I hoped someone would undo that lesson before it became permanent. My father spent those months in a process I can only describe as a long reckoning with the cost of his choices. He cooperated with every federal request. He sold 2 properties to satisfy the debt restructuring. He did not fight me on any of it. He attended every single one of Owen's school events that fall and winter. He sat in a small plastic chair at a kindergarten Thanksgiving program and watched his grandson perform wearing paper feathers and a construction paper turkey hat, and he did not say anything when it was over. He just held Owen's hand in the parking lot all the way to my car. I did not forgive him all at once. I do not think forgiveness works like a switch, but I watched him try and I kept watching. Owen finished the school year with a perfect attendance record and a handwritten certificate from his teacher for most creative story in the class. He wrote 4 sentences about a boy who gets lost in the dark and finds his way home by following a single light in a window. His teacher pulled me aside after pickup and told me it made her cry. I told Owen that evening that he was the bravest person I knew. He looked up at me very seriously from the kitchen table where he was eating apple slices and said, "I know, Mommy, you tell me that a lot." He was not wrong. Some things are worth saying out loud every single day, especially to the person who almost did not make it home, and especially when that person is 6 years old and still believes the world is mostly good. My job from now on is to make sure he stays right about that.